the feed to see if the volume is working. Let me see if I can get the video up.
You're assuming you want me to put my phone on silent?
Here it goes. Yeah, let's see if I can hear it. Okay. All right. So we're good to go there. That's great. If anybody is watching the feed live because they didn't make it to class today and you want to participate or you want to answer questions and get bonus points, you can text me at 414-705-4, area code 405-414-705-4. So if anybody wants to participate in there, looks like there's one person actually live streaming. You can do that and I will answer your questions or give you bonus points for the conversation that you participate in. So we're talking about ethics and we're going to finish up talking about ethics and then we're going to move into the role of IMC within the greater marketing context today. There are 3 challenges to philosophical ethics, and these are used all the time to justify what business people want to do rather than what they should do. Some of them seem intuitively correct, one of them doesn't, and it's actually the hardest one to dispel. The psychological egoism is actually the most difficult. We'll start with subjectivism. Subjectivism is the idea that in ethics, there are no objective truths. That ethics is not like mathematics, where if you have a rectilinear triangle, a right angle triangle, and one side is 3 and one side is 4, the third side has to be 5. That's the Pythagorean theorem. There are these proofs in math that hold for all places and all times. If you're on the moon, this is true. If you're on Mars, this is true. And ethics doesn't seem to be like that. Ethics seems to be something more squishy. The idea that the self is all one can know. We talk a lot in marketing about this idea of empathy. The putting yourself in another's shoes. You can't really know what it is to be somebody else. And so it's intuitively attractive to say, because the self is all one know, all I can do is I can decide for myself what is ethical, and this rejection of the idea that there is an objective truth. And the example I use here from marketing is also one from law. In 1965, in a case called Griswold versus Connecticut, the United States Supreme Court firmly establishes the right of privacy. Now, recently, the Supreme Court has reversed this ruling of Griswold versus Connecticut when they overturned Roe versus Wade. So the progeny of Griswold versus Connecticut is Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which established a woman's right to choose. And the Supreme Court recently overturned that. And what we see is, as a result of these kinds of back and forth, that this doesn't appear to have an objective reality. If we can have one thing one day and not the next, where are we in terms of our moral grounding? What Griswold versus Connecticut said was, the state of Connecticut had a law which made it illegal to possess, distribute, sell, or promote contraceptive devices. And in a very short, pithy opinion by William O. Douglas, he carves out this right to privacy. Now, if I asked you where the right to privacy or the word privacy is found in the United States Constitution, the answer to that question should be it's not found in the United States Constitution. There is no specific right to privacy found in the United States Constitution. What Justice Douglas does in this opinion is he says, if you look at the Bill of Rights and you take it as a whole, there is this right to privacy. Well, where does this right to privacy come from? Well, if we look at, for example, the Third Amendment, nobody ever remembers what the Third Amendment is. The Third Amendment to the United States Constitution says that in times of peace, that no soldier shall be quartered in private homes, and only in times of war by a manner prescribed by Congress. This is like an arcane amendment. What happened during the colonial times was the British would just quarter their soldiers at private farms. They would just show up and you were expected to sort of take them in and house them and feed them. And this was a burden on the colonists. And so when they were developing the Bill of Rights, this was one of the things that was really, I mean, we can't imagine this today, but was really a big deal for the colonists. And so based on that amendment, based on the Fourth Amendment, which says that you are free from unreasonable searches and seizures, that you have the right to due process. So there's two due process clauses in the United States Constitution. One is found in the one is found in the Fifth, and one is found in the 14th Amendment. The Fifth Amendment as well is used by Justice Douglas in this opinion. And that amendment says that you can't be compelled to be a witness against yourself, and also provides for due process. And then if you look at the 14th Amendment, which says that we have due process and equal protection, in the penumbra and emanations of the document, Justice Douglas finds this right to privacy. This right to privacy is then applied to the right to choose whether or not you're going to have an abortion in Roe versus Wade in 1973, which is perhaps one of the most controversial decisions that the Supreme Court has ever made. And recently, the Supreme Court has reversed that and said that Roe is no longer good law. Now, the interesting thing is that as a result of that, states themselves and voters in states are saying that you have a constitutional right. Kansas, of all places, like the most conservative state in the union next to Oklahoma. Oklahoma is the only state that had no county that voted for Barack Obama. We have the distinction of having absolutely no county go for Barack Obama the 2 times he was elected for president. I don't think we had anybody vote for Joe Biden, any county vote for Joe Biden in the last election. Kansas, which is about as conservative as Oklahoma, the voters overwhelmingly rejected a constitutional amendment that would have overturned the state's protection for abortion rights. But this is, if I asked everybody in this room what their opinion is on abortion, I'm not going to do that because, you know, that's beyond the scope of this class. I think everybody would have a different take on it. Everything from you ought to be able to have an abortion on demand to, well, if the case of the health or life of the mother is in jeopardy, you should be allowed to have an abortion. Other countries, by the way, have far more liberal laws on abortion than we do. Yeah.
There have been countries who have said they're safe havens for us.
Oh, yes, Canada has basically.
Sweden said it too.
Yeah, I mean, you can't imagine somebody who's unable to even travel across state lines going to Sweden, but
Yeah.
you know,
Well, people have been
there are nations. I believe that it's either Iceland or Greenland. I can't remember. One of those two nations has almost no children. Like there are literally only 3 children with Down syndrome because they have such a huge push to test neonatal testing for Down syndrome that they have basically eliminated Down syndrome. And one mother, I watched a special on this. I mean, like you talked about a polar opposite from the United States where people are just rabidly opposed to abortion. This one mother was talking about, you know, I think she didn't have the test and she wouldn't have had a child and it ended up with Down syndrome. And she was like, everybody who meets Svenja loves Svenja and says that she's a gift from God. And they're like, oh no. Don't mistake our not being cruel to a child for our, you know, thinking that you made the correct moral choice in this situation, because we don't. Like there's a huge social pressure to not carry to term anybody that's going to be a burden on their system. So there are countries that have far greater, access and even push. And I mean, like in America, this is a huge debate. It's going to be interesting to see overall what happens with that debate. I think what you will have is, I think a majority of the states will ultimately, through voter choice, elect to maintain the status quo ante. I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see if Oklahoma votes that way. I never thought when, for example, medical marijuana was passed that was gonna, I thought that it would be close. I didn't think it would be a blowout. 56% of the voters chose to legalize medical marijuana, and we have the most liberal medical marijuana law in the nation. Not the most liberal marijuana law. Colorado probably has that, where it's just, anybody can buy it. But of the medical marijuana laws in Oklahoma, we have the most liberal. You can get a medical marijuana card for, like I have a hangnail and it's just killing me, and you've got a medical marijuana. I mean, there's no, in other states where they have just medical marijuana, it's limited to a very specific class, like cancer, arthritis, if you have macular degeneration, things like that. Those are the limits on it. So subjectivism is appealing. What can we say about subjectivism? Well, if we accepted subjectivism, we couldn't have any moral standards, right? If it was just up to, we couldn't say that anybody was, we couldn't hold them morally accountable for killing another human being, for example. And I think one of the things that we can say a priori is that you don't have to experience murder to know that you probably don't want to be murdered, right? I mean, like most people want to live. That's, I mean, that's just sort of the human condition. So if we can find one truth that everybody accepts, and I think almost everybody would accept that, like, I don't want to be murdered. I may want to murder somebody else, but I don't want to be murdered. Well, if we can find this one truth, we can say that there's probably others, and there are far more that are becoming more and more universally acceptable in terms of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that's been passed by the United Nations, in terms of, against slave labor and all of these other kinds of things. So subjectivism is intuitively appealing, but when we really subject it to critical analysis, we do see that there are proof-like ideas that we can have in ethics, that there are things that almost all people will agree on, that you shouldn't steal, that you shouldn't murder, that you shouldn't, abuse another human being. Another challenge to ethics is cultural relativism. This one says, again, that there are no a priori truths, but what it does say is that it's group specific. And this leads to a theory called legal positivism, which was a theory that was promoted by Chief Justice William Rehnquist. Legal positivism says that what is ethical is based in law. And again, this is intuitively appealing. And one of the things that we do see is that cultures tend to define themselves by what they criminalize, right? So again, going back to the Supreme Court, for years and years and years and years, in a case called Bowers versus Hardwick, the United States Supreme Court said that the criminalization of homosexual sodomy was absolutely legal. States were free to criminalize homosexual behavior. Now, this is, in many respects, a stupid law, but why do we have this law? Well, it really goes back to sort of a biblical commandment.
Aren't we supposed to keep religion and?
Well, you think that, I mean, there's the difference between an acknowledgement of it religion and an endorsement of religion, right? And the Supreme Court in Bowers versus Hardwick said, look, to overturn sodomy laws would go against 5,000 years of moral teaching. If we look at the Bible, and we are largely a Christian nation, there are a handful of passages in the Bible that support this position. Perhaps the most well-known is Leviticus 18:22. If a man lies with another man as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination and their blood shall surely be upon them. When the word abomination is used in the Hebrew Bible, it is never meant to indicate something that is innately immoral. It was against a cultural mores. The Hebrew people were an enormously small group in the middle of very hostile and adverse conditions. And this premonition, what the rabbis tell us in the Talmud, is that this prohibition is actually about allowing a nation to grow. There is no ability for a nation to grow if you are engaged in homosexual conduct. But it's not innately immoral. This is part of what's called the holiness code for Jews, and there are all kinds of rules in the holiness code. It is not innately immoral for a Jew to eat shrimp, but it is an abomination. It's against culture. And why do we have this cultural premonition or prohibition against eating shrimp? Well, like seafood is very dangerous, right? Like shellfish are particularly very dangerous, and you could die if it's not prepared correctly. So cultural relativism says, look, it's not in the individual, but it is in the group. And so we should look to the law for what is or is not moral. Now, the problem with this is that the law itself, and the law is enormously important and something that we should consider. And so the model is, here's the law, and here's ethics. And where they overlap, there is some consideration, but there are parts of the law that themselves may be immoral. In a case called Plessy versus Ferguson, the United States Supreme Court said that we could have separate but equal treatment of entire groups of people based on the color of their skin. That's innately immoral. The law itself was immoral in that instance. And so it's not that we should ignore the law or that the law is not important, but rather that the law is not sufficient. There are lots of things that I can do to you that may harm you and may be unethical, but are not illegal. And I always give this example. So for example, say you are applying for a job and you ask me for a reference, and I say, sure, I'll be happy to provide a reference to you. And I am an extremely devious character, and I don't really like you. And your employer, your prospective employer, calls me and says, Mr. or Ms. So-and-so has provided you as a reference. What can you tell me about them? And I say, well, I had them in class. They're enormously slow. If they got any dumber, we would have to take them out and water them twice a week. Every single time they opened their mouth in my class, they subtracted from the sum total of human knowledge. And if I were you, I would avoid hiring them at all costs. And let's suppose that you don't get hired. And you find out that this is what I've said. Like, your prospective employer says, I wrote it down as he was speaking. This is what he said about you. Can you sue me and win?
Well,
Probably not. everything I've said is a matter of opinion. You know, you're stupid as the day is long. Compared to what? Compared to Einstein, you know, like, compared to Einstein, I'm not real bright. Compared to my, you know, prairie dogs, I'm a genius.
You have prairie dogs?
Yes, 2 of them.
Aww.
You know, I mean,
Sorry.
and they're very intelligent little creatures, but compared to them, I'm a genius.
I think we need show and tell
You know.
day.
Compared to my cat, I'm a genius. You know, it's all relative, right? That's a matter of opinion. All I've done is stated my opinion. Now, let's suppose that I add to that at the end. And Mr. or Ms. So-and-so is a known felon.
Slander.
Can you sue me now?
Yeah.
Yes, you can, because that is an objective fact. Whether or not somebody, you know, whether or not somebody is slow or not bright, lacks moral character, those are relative terms. But if I say that you are a known felon, that is an objective fact. We can go to the record and look at whether or not you have been convicted of a felony. And if you haven't, now I have engaged in defamation. So the law provides for that, but there's lots of things I can do to you that might hurt you that are not moral, right? I would say that if you ask me for a letter of reference and I say I'll give it to you, probably if I'm not going to give you a good letter of reference, I should say things like, I'll be happy to do this, but I don't think you really want me to do this. I don't think you really want me to write this letter of recommendation for you. Maybe you should find a professor in whose class you performed better than you did in mine. So cultural relativism, I think that we can all come up with things where we say, like, you know, the law is just not enough. But in international business, this is used a lot by companies, particularly American companies, who say things like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is prohibiting us from engaging in business relations that put us at a disadvantage to other countries. Now, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act says basically that you can't go in and you can't bribe government officials in order to do business in another nation. You can't engage in bribery and you know, quid pro quo kind of activities in order to get what it is that you want. Other countries don't have this, and the United States does, and our businesses say, look, you're putting us at a disadvantage. What I would say is that you really should think about this. And there are things that I think that we all just say, and I don't think you should conflate tolerance with moral acceptance. What a lot of businesses argue is, look, the people in China, they like it this way. They like the fact that government officials expect a bribe or a kickback in order to do business in that country. I don't think you should conflate what they tolerate with what is, you know, widely accepted as being good moral practice.
You should be able to like do business on the basis of the fact that your business plan is good and they want to do business
Right.
with you.
Yeah, I think that's what a lot of us would say, is that you know, you can't conflate acceptance with moral tolerance in these instances. The third, and this one is the one that doesn't seem right, but is actually the most difficult to deal with. This is psychological egoism. What psychological egoism says is that either as a result of nature, nurture, or a combination of the two, we can't help but behave in the way we behave. It's what we call a deterministic theory of human behavior. So either as a result of you know, genetics or cultural indoctrination, the choices that you make are not really yours. From a genetic standpoint, what makes a male from a genetic position?
Well, they assign it when you're born with your chromosomes.
which is what? So a female is XX and a male is XY, right?
Yeah.
So everyone who has a Y chromosome, raise your hand. You have
Well,
Y
I think, don't women have,
Like, okay, only one person's raised their hand. Now, you thought you had free will, but why did you raise your hand? Well, because you're trained from an early age, right? Do what the teacher says. If you don't raise your hand, maybe people will look at you because, are you not sure? Right? I mean, there's enormous societal pressure. And so psychological egoism says we behave in these very predictive ways, like raising our hand when the teacher says, if you are, assigned at birth, male, raise your hand, you raise your hand because that's what we're trained to do.
I think that's why a lot of people have so much trouble like dealing with transgender.
Maybe.
Because we're
I think-
trained, our brains are trained to like think this way. So giving them something different to think about is hard for a lot of people that are strictly brought up to believe one thing.
I think that's probably true. I had this debate with one of my students he absolutely was supportive of gay rights, but thought that transgender was a disease or an illness. And I'm like, okay, let's accept your argument that it's an illness. Is there a cure for it?
Yes. Transitioning.
I don't know that there's a cure. Like, I don't think there's a cure for, I mean, like, and even if there is there becoming something other than what they were assigned at birth harming you in any way, shape, or form?
No.
No, if it doesn't harm you, why do you care, right? I mean, if there's no cure and it doesn't harm you, I mean, it's like these people who are opposed to gay marriage, and they're like, it demeans my marriage. How, like, do you love your wife any less because of this? I mean, do you love your children? I mean, how is this qualitatively harming you? I don't understand that position, but psychological egoism says that we're programmed in a way to do the things that we want to do. Now, what psychological egoists say is that we're always selfish. And this seems to not be intuitively correct because we see people acting altruistically all the time. But what a psychological egoist would say is, even though they're acting altruistically, even though Mother Teresa helped the most poor and destitute among us, she was just doing that because she wanted to do that, right? It made her feel good.
She got accolades
Well,
for it too.
What they're conflating there, this is the fallacy of equivocation. They're conflating the feelings that flow from doing an act with the motivation for performing the act. And those are two separate things. I may feel good about giving the homeless person some money. That doesn't mean that it was my motivation for doing it, right? Now, the reason I say it's hard to deny is that if you think about this, can you will yourself to not want something? And my students always say, oh yes, I can will myself to not want something. That's beside the point. Like, if you deny yourself, for example, I like shoes. If I deny myself buying another pair of Allen Edmonds shoes, am I really denying my want for that? Or do I just want something more instead, which is the money in my bank account, right?
Mhm.
I want the money that I have instead of the shoes. But I didn't will myself to want that either. I think one of the things that we can say in response to this is that when it comes to human behavior and emotions, we are enormously complex, and any theory that pretends to say people always do X or they always do Y is suspect, because we're enormously complex, and it doesn't tell us how we deal with situations in which we're enormously conflicted. There are lots of times in life when we have to choose between the lesser of two evils.
You can't
You know?
like categorize everybody in the same thing because like otherwise there wouldn't be murderers and horrible people if we were all like made the same.
Yeah, I think that when it comes to human behavior, we have lots and lots and lots of different reasons why we do things, right? And so we can't conflate motive with the feelings that follow. Talked about cultural relativism. All right, so the problems with these ethical challenges, they're emotive, they're not rational, and they allow for exceptionalism. So they're based on emotion. It allows me to say, I'm special, my group is special, I can't be held responsible. They're not rational, they're not based on something that's logical, and they allow for exceptionalism. So those are the problems. Now, the valid ethical theories are going to be the opposite of this. They're going to be based on reason. They're not going to be emotive, and they're not going to allow for exceptions. That doesn't mean that they don't have problems. They do.
Can you go back one more? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you.
They do have problems, but they all of the valid ethical theories are based on reason, they're not emotive, and they are universally applicable. So they're based on reason, not emotive, and don't allow for exceptionalism. That's what makes a theory valid. So what are the valid theories? Well, we start with Plato's Republic, and in that he answers all of the questions of philosophy, the question of knowledge, the question of conduct, and the question of governance. And what we come up with in Republic is a form of governance in which the best people govern, and everybody is assigned the job according to that which they are capable. You can tease out of Republic the foundations of communism. Some other valid ethical theories, the teleological theory, which is utilitarianism. It focuses on the telos, or the ends. The deontological theory, which focuses on rules themselves, and then Aristotle's virtue ethics. So teleological ethics is also called the greatest happiness principle. You are supposed to, in all instances, maximize the greatest amount of happiness, or if you can't do that, minimize pain. So there's two forms: act and rule utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism is the oldest, and in utilitarianism by Mill, you get this idea. So you have to perform a calculus. Every time you interact with another human being, you have to perform the calculus as to whether or not your action is going to promote or produce the greatest happiness for everyone involved. It's not the greatest happiness for you or for your group, but the greatest happiness for everything involved. Now, this is relatively straightforward to do if you have very simplistic situations, right? So if I have two actors and only two actors, and one of the actors has the ability to increase overall happiness by, for example, giving something to the other actor. If A gives something to B and that makes B better off, and it doesn't diminish A's overall well-being, then you produce the greatest happiness in a very limited situation. So for example, if you have, a lot of money and you see somebody who's homeless and you give that homeless person enough money that they can go out and they can buy something that sustains them, you've produced the greatest happiness. Now that's a very straightforward situation. What if we get more complex? This is the problem with act utilitarianism. How many of you have done something in your life that you thought would turn out really, really great, and it didn't. I can give you examples from my own life. My brother and I, one weekend when we were really very young, both of us, decided that we would make breakfast for our parents on a Sunday morning. And isn't that going to be great? They're not going to have to get up and cook for us. We're going to cook for them. And it went horribly wrong. From the grease fire that started with the frying of the bacon, and to like just a multitude of catastrophes that followed from, we tried to make pancakes and had this grease fire, and then we had all these dishes, and it was a nightmare. But we had good intention, right? From an act utilitarian standpoint, you would say that's a failure. That is a moral failure. It resulted in the fire alarm going off, our parents running into the kitchen, having to put the fire out with the fire extinguisher. I mean, it was a disaster. But our intent was good. In order to try and cure this problem, the second form of utilitarianism, which is called rule utility, says, now look, what we need to do is we need to come up with rules that in the aggregate produce the greatest amount of happiness rather than in a specific instance. So let's take, for example, the case of the serial murderer, or the hypothetical of the serial murderer. Suppose there's a police officer that knows the identity of a serial killer, but the serial killer is very, very clever. And lots of serial killers are very clever. They are highly intelligent. Ted Bundy, for example, who killed lots of women before he got caught. And the only reason he probably got caught is because he wanted to be caught, because he wanted the fame and the notoriety. But a very, very intelligent individual. He had actually gone to law school, I believe, at one point in time. Had a fairly high IQ. Suppose that a police officer knows the identity of someone like Bundy, but he doesn't have enough evidence, because the rule in the United States is that in order to convict somebody, you have to have a unanimous decision of a jury, and they have to reach that decision beyond a reasonable doubt, not beyond a shadow of a doubt, but beyond a reasonable doubt. And there's lots and lots of people that can create all kinds of doubt. I, for example, have never been convinced that OJ killed his ex-wife and her lover. I have driven literally from OJ's house to the scene of the crime, and in the amount of time that it takes to get in the best traffic conditions in LA from his mansion to where they said the crime committed, you just can't do it. It's just not humanly possible to do, right? But a lot of people disagree with me. I'm probably in the minority as to whether or not OJ killed his ex-wife. Most people think that he did. But that's reasonable doubt, right? I mean, like, there's the very dramatic scene where Johnny Cochran has OJ put on the glove that is supposed to have been the glove that he was wearing, and it doesn't fit. And so there became the famous line, if the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit, out of that, right?
Oh, that's where it came from.
That's reasonable doubt. Right? Not a shadow of doubt. Those are all reasonable doubts that you can come up with. So what rule utilitarianism says is, let's say that in the aggregate, we have this rule. It doesn't lead to the greatest happiness in this instance, but overall, it leads to the greatest happiness. So again, back to the serial killer example. Let's suppose you have this Ted Bundy example out there, and the police officer knows the identity fairly well. Should he just go ahead and kill Ted Bundy? Should he just go ahead and take the law into his own hands? There was a movie actually made, Sylvester Stallone starred in it. It was called Judge Dredd. And the police in Judge Dredd, this is what we call a dystopian story where, it's a sort of mixed up world. And in Judge Dredd, life has become so perilous that the citizenry has allowed the police to become judge, jury, and executioner all in one. So if you're caught on the street, the police officer says, citizen, stop, and I will judge you. And if you're found guilty, in the officer's eyes, you're just killed. Most of us are horrified at that prospect of the police doing this, right? I mean, this is the kind of thing that leads to the Rodney King beatings, the George Floyd killing, right? I mean, this leads to really bad results. And so most of us would say no. Even though in this instance, if you absolutely knew to your own satisfaction that you had a serial killer, you shouldn't go ahead and kill them, because that's not the way. If we had that kind of law, what happens in Judge Dredd is that the people fear the police, and it becomes, you know, a nightmare scenario. And if we had this, people thought that this was what the police were overall, wouldn't it lead to ultimately bad results? You would fear the police. You wouldn't tell the police things. You would, you would rightfully run anytime you saw a police officer coming along, because you might be fearful of your life. So in the aggregate, this produces the greatest happiness. The idea that we have a rule of law and that you follow the rule of law leads to the greatest happiness. Now, what's the problem with rule utilitarianism? Well, is it possible to develop a rule for every single situation? I can tell you, as somebody who was the Associate General Counsel here at UCO, every single time we came up with a policy, for example, to allow people to grieve this or that, something happened that people fell outside that policy, or the policy didn't cover it. And so we had to constantly modify the policy or make for exceptions. So that's the problem with rule utilitarianism and ag utilitarianism. There are some things which we just say are creepy and you shouldn't do. Chocolate, for example, is one of our favorite treats. I don't really like chocolate. I'm not much of a sweets person, but lots of people like chocolate. And you would probably be shocked to find out that the vast majority of the world's chocolate is produced by slave or much like slave labor conditions on the west coast of Africa. A small number of people live in really bad conditions. Like, they did a special, I think CNN did the special on chocolate during Valentine's Day. We're coming up, today is Valentine's Day, right? It's the largest chocolate sales in today in the world. People buy all kinds of chocolate, and a very small percentage of the world's population is basically enslaved so that all of us can be happy, right? Like, we get chocolate, you eat chocolate, it tastes good. If we said that that was moral, I think a lot of us would say that's creepy. I mean, like, we shouldn't be doing this. We shouldn't be engaged in this. And there are ways that you can buy ethically sourced chocolates. For example, if it's Rainforest Alliance or Utz Good Inside, those are ethically sourced forms of chocolate. A small number of people are engaged in this kind of less than humane conditions to produce a lot of world's chocolate. And in spite of the happiness that it brings, a lot of us say that, like, that's just wrong. We shouldn't do that, right? Which leads to the antithesis of utilitarianism, which is deontological ethics. There are two types: religious absolutism and rational absolutism. Now, the religious absolutism, the problem with this form is that we're going to have to rely on a book. And whose book are we going to rely on? And then we're going to have to rely on the interpretation of that book. And who's going to interpret the book? That can be problematic. But what is important about duty ethics is that it denies the importance of results. So for Kant, for example, who was a rational absolutist, my brother and I making breakfast for our parents and it turning out poorly, he would give us the A in that case. Even though the results didn't end well, he would still say, you had a good mind and you were trying to do the right thing and you get an A for effort. So it denies the importance of results. You can discern your duties a priori. How do you discern these? Well, a rule, according to Kant, must be logically consistent, universally applicable, and we must be able to know it without relation to experience. Now, what kind of rule could we develop from this? You can't start to cite the categorical imperative and not, after a couple of glasses of wine, sort of begin to chuckle. Because what kinds of rules can you come up with that meet this? Well, Kant says, for example, in all interactions with another rational being, another human being, you must treat that being as a means in and of themselves and never as a means to an end. Well, what does that mean? Never lie. Because when you lie to somebody, you are manipulating them for your own purposes, usually, even if that purpose is intangible. It's the reason, because I'm a neo-Kantian, that I'm also divorced. Because I took this to heart, never lie. How does this outfit look? Well, Robin, pastels make you look like death warmed over. Go back up and change. I will not be seen with you in that, in that outfit. Brutal honesty. Never lie. Well, let's take the case of the inquiring murderer. You live next door to Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Mr. Smith is a violent alcoholic who often beats his wife, Mrs. Smith, and he's told her that if she leaves him, he will kill her. Mrs. Smith is pulling out of the driveway one day, and you say, "Where are you going?" And she says, "I'm going to the shelter for battered women. Please don't tell my husband, but I can't take it anymore." Mr. Smith comes home. Where's my wife? Kant would say never lie.
But then,
Like most of us would say, yeah, lie. And then call the shelter for battered women and say, he's on his way, right? Like lie. Say she went to her mother's, she went to her Aunt Sally's, like lie, and then call and say, yep, he just came home and he's looking for you. Why is it that Kant would say that you can't lie? Well, ultimately, if we lie, we can't have a society that is at all based on mutual cooperation. If we all thought that everything that people told us was not reliable, we could never have contracts, right? So I think ultimately, if you pin Kant down, the reason he would say never lie is because it leads to ultimately bad results. But isn't that a backdoor way of saying that results do in fact matter? So what do I mean by say that I'm a neo-Kantian? Well, I generally think that lying is bad. I generally think it's bad in business. There's a very famous movie that illustrates this called Pretty Woman. Probably most of you have not seen this movie because it's really an old movie at this point. How many of you have seen it? It's Valentine's Day. It's like a very romantic movie. There are parts of it that are, you look at it now, like the cell phones that they had back then, which were these huge devices, and are just kind of laughable. That actually were a phone. Like the only thing you could do with them was actually call somebody else on them. You couldn't play Angry Birds and all this other stuff. In that movie, Richard Gere is an arbitrageur. And what's an arbitrageur? Well, it's somebody who can take something and sell it at greater value than what they bought it for with almost no risk. There's an age-old saying that says, if you give a man a fish, you feed him for today. If you teach a man to fish, you'll feed him for his lifetime. If you teach a man to arbitrage, you will feed him and his family for generations to come. Warren Buffett's an arbitrageur, by the way. That's what Richard Gere does in this movie. and there's a part of the movie where he's meeting with the guy who's gonna take over this guy's shipbuilding company. He's gonna sell the company off because the sum parts are greater than the whole together. And the guy says, I have Navy contracts, and Richard Gere says, no, you don't. I've got those, we've talked to Senator Burr, and those are dead. And then at the end, after he's had this come to Jesus, you know, because he's met this woman who says, what do you make? And he says, I make money. And she's like, but what do you produce? And he has this epiphany that like, he's not really adding any value to anything. He decides that he's going to help this guy. He's going to save his company, and they're going to build ships together. And the guy says, well, what about these contracts that I had with the Navy? And Gere says, well, I was bluffing. I didn't really have them tied up. He's like, you were lying? And he says, yes, it's my job. Should you do that in business? Is lying in business okay? Most of us would say no. Like, that's just not acceptable, right? Now, it happens all the time. Most of us would say, like, you know, in sales, if you lie, I teach sales, what's going to happen? You might get the customer right now, but you're probably not going to keep that customer down the road, right? So problems with deontological ethics, it allows for no exceptions, and ultimately it may be premised on this idea that results really do matter, that they are important. Virtue ethics. This was developed by Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics and the Eudemian Ethics. And what it relies on is what's called the golden mean, this idea that there's a balance, there's a harmony. And it's the mean between extremes. Well, what's an extreme defect of character? Well, cowardice, for example, is an extreme defect of character. This is the person who is scared of their own shadow. They run away at every opportunity. What's the opposite of cowardice? Well, it's the heedless person. This is the heedless person is the one who's always willing to charge into any fight. What's the golden mean between the two? Courage. The courageous person knows when to fight the good fight. It's not every battle. When I was a little kid, I was very passionate about all kinds of things. And I would argue with my mother, and she would say, Grant, you cannot ride a dead horse. And my response to that was, but you can sure sit on it for a while. Right? Like, I was willing to go toe to toe on everything. You've got to be cognizant of when to fight and when to walk away. The courageous person knows that. They know when the fight is worth fighting. And they know when to walk away and save it for another day, right? So you see this and I think as marketers, we can learn a lot from Aristotle. He talks a lot about politics and friendship. There are three types of friendships, according to Aristotle. There's friendship that's grounded in pleasure. These are your drinking buddies. And when you decide that you can't drink anymore and you go to AA or whiskey school, whichever you want to call it, they're going to tell you have to change your playmates and your playgrounds, meaning that you can't stay friends with the people that you used to drink with because they're going to lead you into drinking some more, right? So there's friendship that's based on pleasure. At the opposite extreme is friendship that's based on a necessity or utility. So there's your friends that are useful, there are your friends that are pleasurable, and in the middle is perfected. It's not that your friends who are your friends for life aren't useful to you. It's not that they don't bring you pleasure, but that's not the basis of the friendship. The basis of the friendship is that you befriend A or Bob or whoever because you want what's best for that individual.
You may be useful and you may find pleasure in that friendship, but it's a balance. You see the same balance in politics. Aristotle says there are 3 types of governments with 2 forms. There's governments of one, a few, and many. And then of those types, there's good governments and there's bad governments. A good government of one is called a monarchy. A bad government of one is called a tyranny. A good government of a few is called an aristocracy. A bad government of a few is called an oligarchy. A good government of many is called a polity. And the worst form of government of all is mob rule or democracy. Now, of these, again, what you see is the one that Aristotle really prefers is this one, because it's the one that's balanced. A good government of one, a monarchy, can easily become a tyranny. This happened, if you want a historical reference, with Henry VIII. Henry VIII starts out as this sort of enlightened despot. He was actually a fairly good king, but he radically turned throughout the course of his life as he became obsessed with having a male heir and became a tyrant, beheading some of his wives. A good government of many, a polity, can easily become a mob rule. They can be swayed by a demagogue. This one, aristocracy, you have enough people that you have checks and balances, but you're not likely to descend into oligarchy because somebody will stand up and say, let's not do that. It's the least likely to degenerate into the bad form. It's this idea of balance. And so we can do this, and Franklin actually does this. Benjamin Franklin, one of our favorite founding fathers, actually comes up with 13 virtues. And you can go to 13virtues.com. I'll switch that. And these are what Franklin came up with. Why did he come up with 13? And he put them down on a piece of ivory. And if he had what he called response, he knew there was more work to do. He came up with 13 because 13, if you multiply it by 4, is what? 13 by 4 is 52, if I did my math correctly. Is that correct? 52. How many weeks are there in a year? 52. So you can get through 4 complete cycles in a year. It's the reason why historically there were 13 episodes in a season. So what you would have is the traditional ABC, NBC, CBS would come up with a lineup, and there would be 13 episodes in the fall, 13 episodes in the spring, and then you could have 2 sets of reruns, right? That's why there were 13. Now seasons or whatever, I don't know, like they have 20 episodes and they start in the middle of the summer and they end whenever they end, but historically it was, you started in the fall, you had 2 lineups, a fall lineup and a spring lineup. So you get through 4 complete cycles, and he kept track on this little piece of ivory. And again, if he had what he saw were spots, you knew there was more work to do. Temperance: eat not to dullness, drink not to elevation. Silence: speak not what may benefit others or yourself. Avoid trifling conversations. Order: let all things have their place. Let each part of your business have its time. Resolution: be resolved to perform what you ought, and perform without fail what you resolve. Frugality: make no expense, but to do good for others or yourself. Waste nothing. Industry: lose no time, be always employed in something useful. This one was particularly important to Franklin. As a young man, he noticed he had certain leadership qualities, but he also got into trouble a lot. He led his friends into all kinds of misadventures. For example, they were building a house and they delivered some stones, and he decided that he could just make a little wharf out of those stones and use it to fish off of, and he got caught. So, he resolved to reform himself. Sincerity, use no hurtful deceit, think innocently and justly. If you speak, speak accordingly. Justice, wrong none by injuries, omitting the benefits that are omitting the benefits that are your duty. Moderation, avoid extremes. Forbear resenting injuries so much as you think they deserve. Cleanliness, tolerate no uncleanliness in body, clothes, or habitation. Tranquility, be not disturbed by trifles or accidents uncommon or unavoidable. Chastity, rarely use venery. This is an old-fashioned word for sex, but for health or offspring, and never to the dullness, weakness, or injury of yours or another's peace or reputation. Humility, imitate Jesus and Socrates. He tried doing these things, and by all accounts, he was successful. One of the arguments against virtue ethics are, how do we determine what the virtues are? I think Aristotle does a pretty good job of that, actually. And then how do we determine the virtues? Well, I think Aristotle and Franklin both come up with some pretty good ideas. How do we instill virtues? That's more problematic. Can we instill these in people? Can we teach them? Well, we try, right? It starts at an early age. You're taught in elementary school, for example, that caring is sharing, right? And if you bring cupcakes for your birthday, I never got to do this because my birthday is in July, and so I never got to bring cupcakes for my classmates. But like lots of people have birthdays in other months, and they would bring cupcakes. You can't just bring cupcakes for your friends, right? You have to bring cupcakes for everybody.
You have to give everybody a Valentine.
That's right. You have to give everybody the same thing. All right. Well, we can start.
Do we need to know that 13?
No,
virtues? Okay.
but you can find that. All of my PowerPoints are on D2L,
Okay, I didn't know if it would be on the test or.
so you can find them. So the role of IMC. What is the role of IMC within the marketing context? Well, you need to develop a strategic marketing plan. And based on that marketing plan, and this is the reason most businesses fail, because people project what they want. And usually we don't see this in big businesses, although I can give you examples of this. Sonic, for example, had a guy who was the CEO of Sonic named Cliff Hudson. And one of my colleagues and I used to have a business where we did testing, product testing of stuff. And I'll never forget, this was before we started business, but she gave me this like example from working for Sonic. They did all of this product testing on a new kind of drink. And so basically everything that Sonic makes, it has to be sort of a combination of stuff that they already have, because Sonic's, unlike a lot of businesses, are enormously small, compact spaces, right? So it's a very limited kitchen space, and then they bring the food out to you. There's no indoor dining. There's no room in the kitchen to sort of, so it's got to be all these combinations of stuff that they already have. So they were product testing a new drink, and she was like going through this whole thing. And Cliff in this meeting says, you know what I like? Margarita cherry slush. And Kim was like, we didn't test that. And he's like, well, I think that'd be a hit. Margarita cherry slush. I don't remember what it really was. I'm making this up, but it was margarita something or other. And I mean, like, just the thought of it, like when she told me this is what he'd come up with, it like nauseated me just thinking about it. And she was like, well, we didn't test that. And even if we did, I don't think it would be very, he's like, well, I like it. Most big businesses don't operate on this kind of model, like they actually do product testing and listen to the product development specialists, which is why they're successful. They don't just decide that they're gonna just sell margarita cherry slush. And Kim's response was, Cliff, you're not the demographic that goes to Sonic. Middle-aged white lawyer is not who goes to Sonic. Who goes to Sonic?
Teenagers.
Teenagers and soccer moms. That's who goes to Sonic. That was their, and she's like, the fact that you like this doesn't mean that anybody else will like it. Right? So you have to develop a marketing plan derived from your overall corporate strategy based on the SWOT, the situational analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And you have to identify your market segments and target markets. The antithesis of this is something like, let me see if I can find it. It's still on. All right, let's see, I'll turn this back to here.
So basically footy pajamas.
If I see any of you at a tailgate party in the forever, like I'm calling the psych ward. Literally. It's great for tailgating. It's great for staying at home. It's great, like those lazy days at the office. What? No, like this is like not forever wear. So, you have to, like, there are no segments or target markets in that. It's like great for, the only thing they didn't say it was great for was like your formal ball.
Sleeping.
And I'm sure that there's some formal ball that, that Forever Lazy, they make one with a bow tie on it or something. So you have to identify your segments and your target markets.
That's kind of, I was kind of turned off on the whole like zipping your.
Yeah, right. So your opportunity analysis. Are there alternative markets for current products that you can tap into? This is what Coca-Cola has done. In the United States, Coca-Cola is a brand that's probably in the maturity phase or even in decline. There's evidence now to suggest that even the no-calorie products that Coca-Cola produces, like Diet Coke, have a negative impact. There's some evidence to suggest that they have a negative impact on your blood glucose levels. And so what you're saving is you're saving the calories, but it still spikes the blood glucose level, which, is not good if you're like diabetic. And a huge number of people are type 2 diabetics in this country as we have gotten larger and larger.
Apparently
So
it's addictive.
it is addictive. So where are they selling these products now? Well, largely in other countries, right? So their Coca-Cola is now, exported to every country on earth. And there are, emerging markets for this product. Are there new products for a current market? So what is Coca-Cola doing to stay relevant? Coca-Cola is one of the number one for years and years and years. It was the most valuable brand. It's lost that position, I think, in the last few years, but it was the #1 most valuable brand in the United States. So what are they doing to remain relevant? Well, Coca-Cola is coming up with water, right? Like, who thought you would pay more for a gallon of water than you do for a gallon of gasoline? Well, we do. You know, bottled water is an enormously profitable market. And there's all these other things that go along. It's not just bottled water, it's also, you know, mineral waters and infused waters and all kinds of things. So new products for new markets. So the United States is an old market, coming up with new products for that. New products for new markets, in emerging markets, looking at what the tastes are, for example, in China and India, and coming up with new ideas for those markets is, you know, an opportunity analysis. The competitive analysis, is there direct brand competition? So for Coca-Cola, who's the biggest direct competitor? Well, it's Pepsi, right? Are there indirect products or substitutes? What's a substitute for Coca-Cola? Well, there's coffee products, there's Starbucks, there's all these other kinds of drinks that you can have. What is the competitive advantage? What does the firm do well? Well, Coca-Cola has a vast distribution network, right? They produce products very efficiently. It's cheap to buy Coca-Cola, right? They've got good advertising. They've got a low price, right? What's the competitive advantage? Not everybody wants to be the low price point, right? Rolex, which is one of my favorite because I have an obsession with watches and jewelry. And, you know, I thought my life would not be complete until I got a Rolex, and I browbeat my parents until that's what I got for my high school graduation gift was a Rolex, and I've worn it ever since. So this watch is now like, I don't know, 30 something years old. Rolex doesn't want to sell a watch to everybody, right? That's Timex. Rolex's competitive advantage is that they are exclusive. They don't want to be sold in just any place. From time to time, you will find Rolexes in Sam's Club. You'll find lots of Tag Heuers in Sam's Club because they don't have nearly the contract. But Rolex, if you get a Rolex dealership and you go out of business, that's how Rolexes end up in Sam's Club, is they buy out jewelry stores that are about to go broke. Rolex, you can't do that with Rolex. They are absolutely adamant that you have to sell the product back to Rolex. So that's a good place to stop. I'm out of time. We will pick up with this on next Tuesday, and hopefully I can get us going faster now that we're through the ethics part, which is my favorite part. And we'll make up some time. I will let you know when I will have the first exam up in an email. I'm going to look at how fast I think I can get through the rest of the stuff, and I'll send out probably another email today on where we are. All right. Have a good morning. And I'm going to give you some bonus points for talking today. So just give me a second to. I forgot to pass out ducks. So Ms. Kim, right?
Yes.
All right, I just updated it.
I figured you wouldn't forget about me since there's only 3 people in here.
Right.
Well, I am glad I have you as a teacher again because I liked you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I have to run down the hall. I've had way too much coffee this morning.
See you next Tuesday.
See you next Tuesday.